good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you're joining us. My name's Ali, and this is my second session of the day where we're moving now from perspectives around risk, policy, terms and conditions, silver linings as a result of COVID, securing patient interactions, to now delving deeper into the aspect of data. You've heard me say this many a time, that data is the fuel to our rocket. I say it specifically with regards to AI. And today I also made the comment that data is the oxygen that we take in. However, it isn't as readily available in some instances, and it needs to be given more access to, or folks need to have more ability to engage with it. Many of you would have heard of this statement where we say the goal is to take data, turn it into information, and then take that information and convert it into insight. Today, part of our healthcare track, I'm going to be looking at how we have been able to, here in Ontario, turn some of our healthcare data into information and that information into insight. As you all know, my name is Ali Hirji. You're joining me in the beautiful St. Francis Centre here in the town of Ajax. This land is of the peoples of the Mississaugas of the Scugog Island First Nation. And once again, I thank Mayor Collier and the team of siberX for making this happen. My guest today is someone who has been a part of my own journey, both academically, but as well as professionally. Many of you would have heard of the organization Compute Ontario. Their CEO, a mentor of mine, also a member of the AI Hub Technical Advisory Committee, Nizar Ladak, will always remind you that his process at Compute Ontario has been one about developing not just access to data, but giving folks the tools with which to work with that data. Or as he commonly tells me, it's all good and dandy to bring the folks to the field. What happens when they are there? That's really at the heart of what Compute Ontario has been able to do. C for compute, but C for collaboration. C for community, C for connectivity, and more importantly, C for cybersecurity as well. I'm joined today by Monique, who's going to talk to us about an initiative that was recently launched by Compute Ontario. Monique, welcome to the siberXchange Day 1.
Ali, thanks for having me.
Pleasure is all mine. Monique, tell us a little bit about your own role, but also what is it that Compute Ontario does within our healthcare environment?
So my role is Director of Strategic Initiatives and Partnerships at Compute Ontario. And what that really means is that we're going out and we're seeking collaborative partners with folks who work in the research space. That could be data experts, that could be AI experts, that could be networking experts, it could be cybersecurity experts, and bringing folks together to solve some of the challenges that researchers face with advancing 21st century research methods.
Right.
So we know that Ontario has a great pool of talented researchers.
Yep.
Some of the best academic institutions, and Compute Ontario is really about making sure that those folks have the computing infrastructure they need, the tools that they need, when they need them, and the expertise to support them in making the best out of their research findings and their research journey.
Yeah. We'll talk a little bit about the security of these tools and get into some of the mechanisms in which you are developing the right privacy frameworks, the right regulations, the right compliance standards by which folks can work with this data. But let's peer a little bit deeper into what do we mean when we say compute. Now, we've got audiences who are not just practitioners in IT. We've got, for example, we had Medha Soraya from Connects Health, who's a healthcare professional working and running a digital healthcare firm. How would you explain what compute is, and what are the various aspects that go into compute?
So in its most practical form, when we talk about compute, we are talking about supercomputing and its hardware. So it's not just, it's not just the typical processor that you'd find in your laptop. We're talking about clusters of processors, GPUs, CPUs, with a low latency connection so that we are able to compute parallel computations, simulate models, visualize data in ways that we can't do on a regular computer. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about supercomputing. In healthcare, what we've found is that particularly in Ontario, we have a high concentration of health researchers. We have some of the best health researchers that have made amazing discovery. We have a single-payer health system, and so that gives us a unique data advantage. And with the onset of tools like supercomputing and the uptake of research analytical methods like AI,
Yep.
we're just primed to start pulling these pieces of our research and information and technology sector together in a way that we haven't been able to in the past. So I think that's really exciting.
Yep. Now, this aspect of what I mentioned earlier on is, you take data, lots of data at that, and then you're able to convert it into pieces of information and that information into insight. I want to go on that journey a little bit. Often, we remind our students or remind practitioners that if you're trying to read all of the data that's off the internet, then it's literally like drinking from the fire hose. Can you talk a little bit about when we go on this journey of how can we derive insights from data? Compute Ontario also provides some form of expertise around that. You've got members like Crichlow, you've got partnerships with different academic bodies. Can you talk to us about those collaborations that come together to understand the data?
Sure. So particularly as it relates to the Ontario Health Data Platform, I think it's important for folks to recognize that it wasn't something that just happened overnight. So Compute Ontario and a number of the organizations that are supporting this initiative have been examining ways that we can focus and build trusted computing environments that bring together our administrative health data, that bring together AI methods in a secure supercomputing environment to allow for these new insights and discovery. So it hasn't been just a one-time kind of idea. It's been 5 years, I think, of progressive work with our partners who are in a number of platforms. We started off with a data safe haven, and then we added some AI layers to that, and we spun it up as a new project. And now we're at this interesting inflection point with the Ontario Health Data Platform, where we get to take those learnings, that expertise that all of us have collectively been working on that touch on things like policy, privacy best practices, and really kick it up to the next level because we have COVID and a real need to start solving these problems very quickly for Ontarians.
Yep. So let's then catapult into the world of the Ontario Health Data Platform. We often say, and I know Nizar subscribes to this as well, that adversity or challenge brings out the best leaders and the best leadership and truly reveals the character of an organization. I think often we forget the kind of impact that data can have and the behind-the-scenes kind of role that infrastructure plays. Talk to us a little bit about how did the Ontario Health Data Platform come about, and what was that process like? Typically, if my experience is anything to go by, such initiatives can take anything from 2 to 3 years to put together, and you folks have done it in about probably a month and a half. Talk to us a little bit about what that journey was like.
I think it's been a little bit longer than a month and a half, but you're right. It's been pretty expeditious. So, the Ontario Health Data Platform is a great story in that it was one that was born of researchers. So as you know, we have a large AI community in Ontario. And that group of researchers went to the Ontario government and they said, hey, if you give us a platform with data in it, we can help you solve these questions for Ontario. We know that they're time pressing, we know that they're urgent. And we saw all across the country, Australia, in the States, supercomputing being used to, prototype the gene of the virus, eliminate medicines that were ineffective for vaccine, and really dwindling down the list to just a few set that we could focus in on. So we know that supercomputing has the capacity to accelerate innovation. So it was the right opportunity, I think the right step to take as a province, and Ontario really stepped up, and they backed and they supported this adventure. As you said, typically what we're trying to do with the Ontario Health Data Platform is create a library of data sets that researchers can tap into, and that typically takes a substantial amount of time. There are questions around custodianship. There are questions around, what elements of that data can and cannot be shared. There are questions around governance. The biggest one on a platform like this is obviously, can we make sure that we are de-identifying the information so that there is, so that we're minimizing the risk of re-identification. And all of that takes time, it takes conversation, and it takes a lot of experts and a lot of leadership. And so, typically, as you mentioned, it takes time. It takes a substantial amount of time. But what we've seen is people willing to lend their expertise, really jump in and solve problems around how can we do this better so that we can respond to COVID quickly right now, but also create something that's sustainable in terms of what we can access and learn from and use. So it's been a great opportunity in that way.
Often I've mentioned this to my students, and that is this aspect of, when you've got an idea, it's worthwhile sharing. For example, if I have an apple and you have an apple, and I give you my apple and you give me yours, we're still left with one. But if I have an idea and you have an idea, I give you my idea and you give me yours, we're each left with two ideas. And that's the coming together of great minds and sharing and success. What was that journey like? Because in the field of healthcare, especially with healthcare data, the willingness for parties to come to the table, to discuss sharing, it's not that it's, for lack of a better word, there's no animosity there, but there's fear and resistance because of certain the compliance frameworks that institutions have to adhere to.
Right.
How did you put together all of these experts in order to say to one another, how do we find the right point at which we can share our data, be secure, and be satisfied with the processes we have in place? Who were some of these leaders? Where did they come from? What were those conversations like? And I assume you had a central role in shaping all of this.
So I think it's important to note with the Ontario Health Data Platform that the Ministry of Health here in Ontario is the custodian of the data that is in that platform. So that means, it's not. They are responsible for the oversight of that data. They're taking stewardship of that data, of Ontarians' data, and I think that's the right approach for a platform like this. It's the trusted, neutral person to oversee this platform. What that does mean, though, is that experts. So, we have prescribed entities who have been given certain permissions in this instance, to share information with the ministry into our secure environment, and that has made a difference because what we now have is trusted and authoritative folks who are experienced with handling our health data, providing it to the platform in a way that is privacy protected. And then once it gets into the platform, again, there's just another layering of work that happens in terms of those privacy protections. So it was a real thoughtful process around developing a governance model that we thought, what is the best approach that is going to allow for transparency, accountability, move the needle, but still protect the privacy of Ontarians. And so that was, governance and who was doing what was a big part of it. Privacy protections has been a big part of the conversation. And naturally, as you talk about privacy, you start to talk about other aspects of that, like security. So it's been, like I said, it's been a team. This has definitely been a team sport from a number of experts with longstanding history in our public sector.
Tell us a little bit more about, you've mentioned aspects from the public sector. And I know that, listening to us live right now, we don't just have folks from public sector, we have folks from private sector as well. AWS is a good example from a computing perspective. We have other folks from Zscaler to Palo Alto to a whole bunch, the Phelps Group, different folks playing different roles in the world of cybersecurity. Was the private sector at all able to participate in some of the work that you are doing or access some of the data? How do you manage that relationship?
So currently the purpose of the platform is for researchers to provide insights to the government on policy directions and issues that we do see happening as a result of COVID. So our first focus has been on on enabling research and researchers. I think what is interesting, and is something that we will have to consider as, you know, as the need for platforms like this continue to grow, is how can we build trust and expertise with the private sector. I think that's an important conversation that that needs to happen if folks are thinking about the longevity of this type of infrastructure.
And again, this is another very powerful point, which is the longevity of such infrastructure. Some aspects that we often see when it comes to initiatives that are responsive to certain situations. So the pandemic being one, very reactionary, very time sensitive, spasmodic. Just a couple of months, you have access to something. Let's see what we can get done. And then if there's a vaccine, things are done. There seems to be more to this. There seems to be something more holistic around this, which is you want to create a culture around sharing of healthcare data. What do you see as the vision for Ontario Healthcare Data Platform in terms of going forward? I know COVID right now, we're looking at insights, and I would like to discuss what some of those insights could look like. But is this a long-term initiative, or is it specific to the pandemic response?
So in its current state, it is very specific to the pandemic. We are anticipating our current year worth of work, and perhaps 2 more years out of this. That's the timeline that experts have provided for what is reasonable in terms of pulling this information together. I think our hope is, as a research community, that the investment in this infrastructure and the insights gathered from this platform demonstrate the value that that can be derived from investing long-term in these types of platforms. It's a significant investment to stand up computing environments like this that are looking at the most current types of technology. It requires not just in terms of the cost of the capital and the hardware, but if you think about the people time, if you think about the skills and education, like we're not just talking about principal investigators that are accessing these platforms. We're talking about principal investigators with an academic agenda who are trying to train the next generation of talent. All right, so there's a substantial investment that's being made in terms of skills to deal with all aspects of this platform, not just on the data analysis, right? It's all aspects of it: the architecture, the security, the governance, the policy, the law, like all aspects of it. And that's a substantial investment that I think can have longevity if folks see the value in it. So I think your question about what types of insights is one that most Ontarians would want to know. If we're going to be spending this money, what can we hope for out of this platform? What's the return exactly?
I've often said this, that success isn't an accident. It comes with practice. It comes with failure, but it also comes with surrounding yourself with the right people. Now, although folks may not necessarily see the direct relation here, but part of security is making sure that the right people are there for the right conversation. How do you support a researcher? Let's say you've got a graduate student, so on and so forth, with a particular interest, let's say in understanding the impact of COVID-19 on a particular function, let's say wait times. Okay. How do you support that particular researcher? Sure, that researcher may have a supervisor on campus, may have some colleagues who are research assistants as well. What else does Compute Ontario, besides the data and compute, what else do you bring to the table? And I guess I'm alluding to some of the scientific advisory committees that you have. How do they shape into this fact?
So particularly as it relates to the Ontario Health Data Platform, so I'd make 2 points. One is that most people have heard of it, but 5 Safes. 5 Safes has been a framework in which we've been establishing our business principles and our privacy and security processes, as well as our technical safeguards. And what the 5 Safe model does is it allows you to focus on safe projects. So particularly for this program, we want to make sure that not just for our classical researchers, but for our ML researchers, that the projects that they're selecting obviously have to be COVID related, but that the research ethics board approval that they have to go through to get access to the data is one that is expeditious given the pandemic, but is also countering against, the ethical implications that come with this type of research. So that's one element, I think, that adds a very interesting factor. And as you go down into the model, it's about safe people. So again, we've started with researchers as our first group. And there's a number of things that they have to do to demonstrate their ability to access the platform. So there's applications, there's training, there's agreements that have to be signed before they can even begin to access the platform. And as they go through that process of the application, there is a scientific team and there's a technical team that are supporting these research groups as needed to help them answer questions with, around allocations or this data means this and what that data means. So it really is like a community sport. I have already talked about the data aspect of the five safes a little bit, and the fact that we're focusing on pseudonymized data in this platform so that we can minimize the risk of re-identification of individuals, and some of the ways that we'll be addressing some of the methods that we'll be applying there. Correct. Just to make sure that there isn't any risk of re-identification. And there's a number of things that folks can do around that that involves software and safeguards as well as privacy protections. And so I think that piece of work is substantial in this platform. Then obviously there's the safe environment, which is where things like isolation layers and making sure that we have restricted workspaces and certain data cannot flow a certain way within the platform, just to make sure that we're maintaining safeguard. Yep. Has really been interesting for us to work through and think about, because we're not just talking about a single purpose platform. We're talking about like multiple scenarios and an anticipated high use platform around that. Yeah. And then obviously the last part of the five safes model is the safe output. So making sure that what is the research findings that are coming off are not cannot help with re-identification, right? That people cannot be identified, and that support those analytics and findings. So so that is quite a process. Yeah. But to your point, requires business processes, people processes, and security safeguards, and a substantial amount of information and training. So learning from the students' end on what all of these things mean as they go through this process, but being supported by a community of experts. And I think it's important to note that when we build platforms like this, it's not just it's folks that have spent 4 years, 12 years studying computing infrastructure, cybersecurity, data itself. So there's a whole variety of skill, I think, that comes into this platform, and that is it just speaks to how complex health data is in enabling. Yep. But I think you said it earlier, and the ability to gain insights from health data is imperative, and especially in this instance, and so important. So getting this whole process right, I think, really matters, and will be a great. I think Ontario is doing all the right things, and we're positioning ourselves well, and will be a great example for other provinces that hopefully want to follow in our footsteps.
Controls, I was talking about this in a previous session on risk management. Controls are not in place to sort of prevent us from doing something wrong. They're sort of there to reduce the harm. If we make a mistake, or we went down a particular path and unraveled an insight, there are controls in place to protect further harm. Yeah. Right? And there's sort of a risk matrix that we all go through just to make sure that we're covering ourselves where necessary, and making sure that you reduce the harm to both the researcher and those being researched, et cetera. But all of this takes time. The process to onboard somebody onto a project, give them access to the data, all takes time. And this was not a luxury, or rather is not a luxury, that you currently have in the state of this pandemic. How were you able to make that process faster, where you got the data in the hands of these researchers quickly enough for them to be efficient enough?
So one unique aspect of the Ontario Health Data Platform is that it's federated. Yep. So what that means is that there are two computing environments. And so earlier I had spoken about Compute Ontario having partnerships and longstanding histories on standing up trusted compute environments. So our most recent initiative, right before we went into the Ontario Health Data Platform, was an AI secure health platform that, from a technical and privacy and security perspective, met much of the requirements that were needed for the Ontario Health Data Platform. The second environment that's being built out is actually one where we are hoping that folks can have more access to more compute. So we're talking about 300 plus GPUs and CPUs. So that's when I think the first cluster is around 50. So so the scale is substantial on the second one. And then the type of data. So with that level of computing, you can have more unstructured or large data. So genomics data, imaging data, and those data will provide different insights than what we currently have in terms of administrative data. So the answer is, how did we do it so quickly? We've leveraged what we've invested in already as a province to give folks immediate access while we build in parallel a larger, more complex computing environment.
Yep. And none of these projects are basically funded from one source. Many of them take on multiple sources of funding with multiple rules and criteria. So for example, and perhaps this doesn't apply, but if someone has Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council funding, needs access to the data, there are certain rules that apply to SSHRC-related projects or NSERC-related projects. How have you navigated some of the rules there? Because in many cases, and correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, you are the policy kind of individual, but in many cases, some of the terms and conditions that come from funders have not been updated for some substantial time.
So in this instance, for the Ontario Health Data Platform, in most instances, researchers are getting access to the platform for free.
Okay.
So when I say free, it means that the Ontario government has agreed that this project warrants access to that platform at no cost to the researcher. Obviously, the time of the people that support the process is a cost, but we're not charging researchers access to this data and this platform. And part of that is because we believe in the insights and what this type of model can demonstrate. So. If we are really going to be talking about vaccinations and their efficacy, we really need to make sure that we understand, a lot about our healthcare system and the trends and patterns that exist in our current vaccination records. So I think there's a lot to be learned, and with that in mind, making sure that it was accessible to researchers without the worry of those funding complications was top of mind in its design.
Yeah, and speaking of these funding applications as well, if I can reverse that a little bit, because we do have a lot of researchers that are listening to us on this platform, was there any funding made available to actually conduct research, or was this purely bring your own funding and access the data?
So it's no cost to access the platform.
Yep.
And so the first set of data that we've queued up 8 set of data, and we're in the process of bringing up another 4 data sets, but all administrative data. And the strategy that I'm working on right now actually is how do we expand that rapidly so that we can respond to a wave 2 if it happens.
Right.
How can we let researchers safely and securely bring other types of data sets into this platform? Because while we've started with one model, we recognize that research, the power of research.
Yeah.
Is in the ability to bring together vast amounts of data, and so our ability to expeditiously secure data sets will be a challenge, but a priority and a necessity if we are going to advance in this platform.
One thing about the research community, especially in Canada, is that we've not sort of remained insular to our own practices. While we celebrate Canadian researchers and Canadian innovators, we've always found ways to partner internationally. Was there any international implication or influence on the creation of this health data platform, or any best practices that you've seen around the world that became sort of the signature template upon which to sort of size our own Ontario response from a data perspective?
So I would say that, the question of trusted research environments is not unique.
Yep.
They're everywhere. But the UK has a substantial amount of work in this space around data safe havens and trusted research environments. And we were in touch with a collaborative out in Scotland and the UK around some of the work that they're doing right now around some of that similar work. We also have an MOU with NCSA, which is a supercomputing group in Illinois, and there again, it's just about sharing ideas about and challenges. And so I think the more that we can bring folks together to say, hey, what are you doing? Even if it's across Canada, that helps.
Yep.
But you're right. Research is not. It's someone local, but it's definitely international in reach.
It has an international ethos to it, which again allows us to sort of peer into this aspect of data modeling and data curation, so on and so forth. Obviously, you've seen a large interest in this data set. And it's an interest not just from researchers just interested in seeing what this data is like and trying to see, hey, let's see what we can get out of it. You're getting some very targeted interest in as well. What are some of the locks and controls that you have in place to ensure that, and forgive me for sounding a little elementary here, but to ensure that nothing facetious is taking place there? Besides just, I believe you have to register and submit interest, so on and so forth. Talk to us through, what is that application process like? What's the vetting process like?
So you're right, the application process, it does ask a number of substantial questions. Your project does have to be approved, but I think that, in terms of the data and its security, some of the aspects of the system are the ones that you would anticipate and expect.
Right.
So I'd mentioned them earlier, isolation layers, that have been created around the environment so that data can only go in and out of a certain way.
Yep.
Secure workspaces and restricted workspaces. So a lot of the platform has been partitioned to allow for only a certain type of procedure to happen in one aspect of the platform. So only in this space can this happen. Can data be prepared for a researcher? Only in this space can the researcher access and use that information. If you are working in a research team, then there's opportunity for you to collaborate and share and move your information between your team.
Yep.
But all of that is around approvals and safeguards and checks. And so it's interesting because I think when I think as a researcher, you want to do your research. You just want to do your research. And I think as someone who's part of the team designing the platform, we want to enable the easiest flow of research, but we also recognize that, restricting movement of data within the platform is one of the ways that we can help to keep it secure.
Yep. This is an interesting concept with the restriction as one of the parameters for security, but I guess that also lads on to authentication and logins and all of that.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, you're right. So everybody that is, everyone that is coming in, we do have to authenticate their identity, and it's the typical things that you would expect, and unique identifiers for everybody, and that number traveling through the system. There's auditing capabilities throughout the platform as well, so what happens as the data moves. But authentication has not been an easy.
Of course not.
It's never straightforward. It hasn't been an easy hill to climb, but I think it's a solvable problem. We've got a good approach for this.
Yeah, we were, as part of the CyberXchange, we've been doing a couple of power hours, and one of the things that we've been talking about, I got to speak with Bill Harmer. Not sure you remember him. He is was at Zscaler before as their CISO, and now is the CISO at Secure Auth. And one of the aspects that we sort of delved into is that authentication is not just about you are who you are, but it's also about at the very get-go, in a matter of seconds, explaining why you're there. And the ability to track what someone's using and how they're progressing through a particular platform, which makes authentication a very complex process and not just a matter of I've got the key and now I can enter through the door, which allows me to sort of go into a little bit of a different tangent of a conversation, but sort of back to the health data platform piece. And that is, once you have, you've got users now, you've got people requesting access to this data, what's the method by which you are communicating some of the results? Are you playing a part in that, or is it, researchers, here you go, you've got access to it, now it's up to your own knowledge translation and dissemination devices to get the word out there?
So I would say that Knowledge translation is definitely a critical piece of this platform. You don't make the types of investments that the Ontario government has made in this without the understanding that, in particular ML and AI researchers, that their insights will be different than what we might find in classical research. And I think that one of the challenges there is really trying to understand, how can we trust those findings in such a new and novel research method? Very few people are familiar with ML techniques.
Yep.
And so there's a lot of conversation that happens, and there's a lot of process that we've built in and we are exploring around, governance, use, explainability of those findings. The research community is very interested in working with clinicians and policymakers and their research peers to say, are we finding what we are, are we really finding what we're finding, or is it something else? And so going back to that idea of who's at the table, I think it is important for knowledge translation. We also know that as we start to move into other types of data, Indigenous data, that those require a different type of governance framework and a different conversation around how those projects are prepared, how those data are used, and the explainability of those data. So knowledge translation is definitely, I think, going to be, it is a key pillar of the program, but I think it'll be a challenge for us to be able to meet the demands of all of the variety of techniques that will come out of that, because we're not just talking about classical research methods. We're talking about ML and AI, which have a variety of methods within it for discovery. So a lot of learning will be happening, I think, for everybody on both ends of the table.
For our audience that oscillates between both public and private sectors, this question about public compute versus private sector compute is probably something that you've dealt with quite a bit, and sort of raised some questions around why would we use a public sector mandated service versus something that could be made available at scale and on demand from a private sector. What's the difference between working within a Compute Ontario public cloud kind of, not necessarily a public cloud, but a public sector run cloud environment versus a purely private sector piece? Do you have other partners like SOCIP and so on and so forth that come to the table? Can you help us understand the differences between private and public sector?
So stepping back from the Ontario Health Data Platform, I think this question of how can we leverage commercial cloud and its benefits for research is core to the work that Compute Ontario will be doing over the next little while. We recently ran a pilot study with some folks from AWS. Shout out to AWS if they're there. And we were looking at performance benchmarks of HPC in the cloud versus something that had been beta tested in one of our larger platforms. And there were some learnings I think on both ends. And so what we found with commercial cloud is that they have the latest technology. They have a lot of great tools that researchers want to access, and researchers are choosing to access because they can't get all their computing needs met through us. But the support and expertise that they need sometimes isn't always there with the commercial cloud provider. Right. And then there's some price point differences around cost. And then back to your point around funding is, and if they put in their grant that they're going to spend their money this way, that's one thing. But we also know that because you're on your own learning in the cloud, you're going to burn through those cycles pretty fast, quickly, right? So Compute Ontario is looking at ways in which we can work with researchers, the government, and industry to figure out what are the right types of use cases for cloud, commercial cloud. How can we make sure that the skills and expertise exist with the cloud vendor and within our own communities from researchers and folks who we work with to support that? How can we fund that type of research? Because what we know is that those types of environments will allow us access to new tools and new security features that we may be limited to.
Makes sense.
Based on the fact that we're publicly funded. Our capability is limited to what the federal and provincial governments fund.
Obviously, when you take on such a massive endeavor, which is to correlate data from multiple, what we like to call, we use the word big data, and these, I don't necessarily subscribe to the terms, but you hear terms like data lakes and data oceans, and now people talking about data tsunamis, and all sorts of things about, just meant to say one thing is that there's lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of data. Fair enough, but when you create an infrastructure to ingest all of this data, to process it, to compute through it, to store it, to disseminate it, you need certain technical skill sets.
Yes.
I know that Compute Ontario has now gone down the path of offering technical workshops. So what I believe I was hearing of, you use the term, highly qualified professionals, and because of the lack of highly qualified professionals to work with this data, you started offering workshops to ensure that not only you can train folks in how to work through these supercomputing environments, but also how to be more secure and adhere to different regulatory frameworks. Can you tell us a little bit about what these trainings are like, what these workshops are like, who can access them, and what's the breadth looking like for the rest of 2020?
So what I will say is that Compute Ontario does work with its consortia partners. So there are clusters of folks across our universities that offer training on data science, AI methods, and advanced analytic techniques. But in addition to that, there, like I said, the community isn't homogenous. We have working relationships with Vector Institute, and they have a series of certificates that they've just released. We work with folks, out of like Orion, and we want to work with at folks at Durham College, right, to talk about how do we build up the security skill. Because when you were talking about these types, like these large computing platforms, what you are talking about is the Ontario Health Data Platform is a perfect example, is bringing together, you need a security expert, someone, but not just any security expert, a security expert that understands AI. Yeah. And AI methods. You need a student who can use those methods. You need, it's a number of things. So what we've been really focusing on is creating partnerships with folks like, Orion, Vector, and others, and trying to spread the word about their work and their partnerships, and augmenting that, because we recognize that it's not going to be it's not a single skill, it's not a single technique, and that folks will need to be successful in data. It's definitely a team sport. It's definitely, perhaps more than when you and I studied R for statistics. But it's definitely one of those things where I think folks should, there's a lot of great stuff out there. So Microsoft offers stuff, NVIDIA offers stuff.
Yep.
There's a lot of folks out there that offer stuff that I think are really great and really helpful, and some of it's free and some of it's at no cost. Yep. The only benefit, I would say, of working through an institution like a college or a university is that you're getting taught those techniques along with the research methods that come with your educational background, or the knowledge that comes with your educational background. So it's more tailored to what your interests are and what you're studying. So I think that people often overlook those aspects of it, and so for sure you can definitely take those private stuff, but I wouldn't bypass the colleges and the universities, because they do have some free resources, they have some at-cost resources, but they're definitely all tailored with your education and knowledge domain in mind.
Yep. When you look at the supercomputing environment in Ontario, and we've spoken at large around data privacy, data security, the locks and balances. What I've really enjoyed on this journey so far with you is that you haven't peered into some of the technicalities, like what is the type of firewall, etc. But you focused on the human aspect of it, the human firewall, the human need to understand policy, so on and so forth, which really goes, is a good percentage of steps towards ensuring that you've got good cyber hygiene and a good cyber awareness program running in parallel with your core functionality, which is around data. I've really enjoyed the fact that you've not deterred away from your core business, which is processing of data, and you've maintained a conversation around cyber, around privacy, so on and so forth. But this does still ask me to ask you the question about, there must be some things that keep you a little nervous about what could happen with this data if not curated correctly. Can you tell us a little bit about what may keep you a little bit, for lack of a better word or sentence, up at night when it comes to the security of this data?
So, I think when it comes to COVID-19 research, we've seen a lot of state actors targeting repositories that hold COVID data and COVID data research. In the spring, there was just a whole surge across, Europe and the United States and even here in Canada. And that was, I think that's concerning, is that researchers who are trying to do really great work are being targeted by state actors, maybe by some kid in some mom's basement, I don't know, but mostly state actors was what we've seen with COVID-related research. Part of that, to me, speaks to the competitive nature of science, research, discovery, and economic benefit. Everyone wants to be the first to find something and prevent someone else from finding something. But it also says to me that cybersecurity has to be more than your safeguards. It has to be, encouraging people to ask questions. Was that email really from Ali? Was he really? Did he really need my phone number?
Right.
Because he forgot something, or was that a phishing email? And I think so. I think the more vigilant we are around having those conversations around how breaches can occur, what some of those intrusions might look like. I think that is definitely one. So just that, building a positive data culture around an organization. I do think you do need, good cybersecurity tools and techniques, obviously, like that's a must. I think one of the challenges that we face is that a lot of folks don't understand the importance of funding cyber upfront in a project. And what that might mean in terms of cost and expertise. And so I think the cyber community has a role to play in educating decision makers, whether they be executives in a business or governments, on the importance of investing in cybersecurity upfront.
Yep.
And so I think, and it's just recognizing that it's not a one-time stop. So you don't invest a bunch of money. You don't just train someone once. That cybersecurity is about an ongoing conversation around how do we, make sure that our culture, our people, our tools, our techniques, our methods, our evaluation, our processes are all coming together. And so it becomes quite complex, but I think it definitely necessary for 21st century research, discovery, and business processing.
We'll reverse gear a little bit into a conversation that we had sort of in the 5th minute of our chat, and we spoke, or rather we highlighted the word governance not once, probably even twice. And we've got a question that's come in, which is really looking at the foundations of data governance. What are you currently using when you are engaging with different stakeholders? And if I can add a little bit a line or two to this question, I believe this is coming from from two standpoints rather. The first is there's always this fence around sharing public health data or just health data in general. But number two is that there is this fence around sharing data because it then creates a bit of I wouldn't necessarily call it an equitable state for innovation, but it does sort of equalize the innovation sector where now if you have access to the same data that I do, you can actually do more with it or maybe compete with me. So what kind of governance frameworks do you have in place to solidify the way in which you're going to start working with data?
So I think that just going back to first principles, that idea of the intentionality of the platform and the data and its uses has been critical to our data governance framework. Minimizing, I think one of the challenges that kind of from a data perspective that keeps me up is how do we harmonize or bring alignment to our understanding and agreement about those data and its uses? Talk to anybody who's working with multiple sets of data, and they'll talk about all the data sharing agreements that they have to navigate and negotiate. And as you pointed out earlier, they don't all say the same thing that is permissible with that data. So I think there needs to be a conversation around kind of, what can we do to improve, things there so that in certain instances, for certain intentionality, it's easier for people to access data. IP and always comes up in conversations, I think, around data and protecting ownership. And I think that matters. Like, we have to recognize that, even as an academic, my career stems on, my ability to find new things, publish about it, and build academic traction around them.
Right.
So there definitely is, we're cognizant of the fact that we want to promote this research, but we also want to make sure that researchers have a certain amount of privacy and control around their research and research findings. So it's definitely a challenge, it's definitely a balance, and I think this platform will bring us closer to new ways of thinking about data governance, but that are core to intention, use, and purpose of that data.
You know, these rockets of innovation like AI, et cetera, you know, we said it earlier, right? Data is the fuel for this. How do you work with researchers who eventually might be looking to commercialize some of their findings or be looking to create some sort of a byproduct of their findings and then go out into the market through for-profit ventures, including venture capitalists, including angel investors? How is IP managed, and how do you create some sort of boundaries which are not rigid, but agile enough to allow for innovation?
So in Ontario, you know this, Ali, from your work in the college, and you know, IP and how do we innovate in a way that reflects 21st century needs is a big conversation right now in Canada and in Ontario. I won't speak to the Ontario Health Data Platform, but what I will say is that Compute Ontario, in collaborations with its partners like SOSIP, take these considerations very seriously. You know, how can we make sure that industry and academic researchers are aware of each other, are partnering, so that they can do things like commercialize in a way that is, you know, represents both the interests of the researcher and the industry partner, because people do want to commercialize and people do want to scale. And I think that health has been one of those places where folks feel that they haven't necessarily seen all of those returns. But I would also point to the fact that from a drug perspective, there's a number of pharmaceutical companies that have done well. Yeah. And even from a big data perspective, I think Blue Dot, which was started by a physician in a downtown hospital, was one of the first organizations to draw global awareness to the fact that COVID was going to become a pandemic through their techniques. So I think that there have been models that show that researchers can use data, their techniques, and commercialize in a really great way, and Blue Dot has been a really great story around that. But we should acknowledge that it's a challenge, and that there are things that we need to do differently as folks who support research.
In the process of setting up the health data platform, was there any public consultations that were conducted? If yes, can we talk a little bit about them? If not, what was the approach in terms of keeping the public informed? Because as we've just discussed, right, and I don't mean this to be disparaging of the public, but of which I'm a part of too.
I'm a part of too.
So are you. It's not necessarily that there's always suspicion, but we tend to be fearful of the unknown. We tend to not necessarily enjoy the uncertainties of certain research pieces. There are certain black boxes that we open up when we go into research. That is the beauty of research, right? That uncertainty tends to be beautiful. But with healthcare data, with the crisis, with the pandemic, with the fear, so on and so forth, did you have to do any public consultations? Walk us through that.
So we've been very, transparent in our approach. So there's a website. If you go to Compute Ontario, you'll find a microsite for the Ontario Health Data Platform, and that has been the home to where we have been posting about our progress to date on this platform, where researchers can go and log in and submit their application. But you're right, in making sure that the public is aware of all the ways in which data about them could potentially be used for social good, I think is an important conversation and an important education piece. Definitely as we start to branch into different types of data, there's going to be a greater need, I think, for engagement with various groups. And so one of the things that we're looking at in our data strategy is how do we do this effectively now that we're moving beyond this core set that is a traditional data set into other types of data that capture new data elements that we haven't captured before, whether it be around socioeconomic status or such. How do we ensure that there is governance, consultation, information, and awareness sharing? And so I think that'll be a critical piece for the team at the OHDP as we move forward, making sure that data governance that public awareness, that opportunities for the public to learn more about their information and their data and how it can be used matter. It's not unique to the OHDP. I think it's something that we have to do, and the Ontario government had started to do before the pandemic, as well as the federal government. So I think this will just, the OHDP will be one example in many on how data can be used. Actually, the new COVID app is probably a great example.
Very good example. I was actually going to come to that. Yeah.
Do you have it?
I do have it, but I'm not sure about everybody else, but I do have it. And we had a session with Dr. Ann Kavukian where you sort of had to do the risk-reward analysis, right? And you have to see, you have to think about what are you getting out of it versus what you're putting into it. And I guess everybody to some extent has to sort of do that risk analysis. And sometimes, as one of our previous speakers had mentioned, that sometimes risk is good. And sometimes it's not, and you have to weigh that out, right? It's a fundamental difference between what is risk and what is risky.
Yes.
And I really, really enjoyed that parallel as well, which allows me to also flip in. I know we've got another 3 minutes. I want to sort of conclude with, we've spoken about, if somebody wants to get involved, who they should reach out to, and all of that stuff. Can you talk to us a little bit about what are the types of projects that you're seeing right now? Yes, we spoke about some of the insights, but talk to us a little bit about if somebody's interested in a project, what kind of projects are sort of being welcomed, are being reviewed? What are some of the parameters they need to have in place from a security standpoint? Can you talk to us a little bit about so that the community can feel engaged enough to say, yep, we would like to reach out?
So I'm going to get this wrong, but I think there are 9 or 12 research priorities that the Ontario government has laid out. And they're available. So if you go to the Compute Ontario website, you'll see that information on our website. But they run the full gamut from, supply chain issues to transmission and pattern around transmission. And and that's where some of the most of the early work has been focused. But there's about, I would say, 9 or 12 research priorities that have been outlined for the government where they are accepting projects to come in as long as they meet one of those boxes. And so if the researchers are interested, please check out the website because we want the whole variety of projects to come in, and each one of those projects, depending on where they are in that spectrum, will require new and different types of data that we need to bring into the platform. So we do need that variety in order to drive the types of data we collect, because it's all being driven by research demand. If the demand isn't there, then we won't pursue it.
We've heard a lot of horror stories around certain healthcare facilities having data breaches, having loss of data, and you've mentioned, and in fact, in one of our first sessions today, pandemic attacks, we talked about the increase not just in volume, but in frequency of attacks. From your perspective, how well placed is Compute Ontario to continue this journey to ensure that the data access is secure and well protected? And what are some of the upcoming initiatives that we'll expect to see from Compute Ontario?
So just the same as our data partnerships, the security piece runs the same, and so we have engagement from all levels of government, and so the best security advisors, I guess, in the country and in the province who are advising our teams on considerations for this platform. So I think that's one of the unique things about this platform is that COVID, it's that it's really corralled folks. So I think that type of consideration from federal security experts to provincial security experts to security experts who have been working on our systems for a long time brings a it helps to validate things for us and brings new insights and considerations that are equally as important for us to consider as we move forward. But it also speaks to how seriously we're taking the protection of this information. Going forward, so we talked about it in terms of, data and other aspects, but I think just going forward, we want to start reaching out to folks a little bit more. So hopefully you'll start to see some more information coming about the platform and ways that people can get engaged, and hopefully we can build community around it.
Fantastic. Well, Monique, with that, I have the task of summarizing this wonderful conversation. And what I will say is that I've learned quite a few different things in this engagement. But for our audience, I'll go back to something I may have said in a previous conference, which maybe a couple of years ago, where I made a statement around, if you cannot connect, you cannot compete. I think now, I'll replace the word connect, although a little watchfully, with if you cannot compute, you cannot compete, and you cannot collaborate. That doesn't mean that we have the connectivity issue solved across Canada. There are many communities right now still relying on outdated networks, but the conversation has gone a lot stronger on that front. Now we're beginning to realize the ability for us not just to have access to the data, but know that once we have entered the room full of data, what tools do we have in our hands in order to draw meaningful insight from it? And as they always say, we shape our tools and our tools shape us. How we use these tools ultimately impact how we come to understand pandemics such as COVID-19 and how we come to understand the best responses. With that, once again, I want to issue out a huge congratulations to Compute Ontario for putting up this platform, which is one of its kind, I would argue, globally, and has put Ontario on the map, but more importantly, has shown us the value and impact that data can have on human lives. The return on investment is extremely strong, and I wish you all at Compute Ontario the very best, and encourage all of you to check out their website, get in touch with them, and if you've got ideas, to bring it to their table, and consider partnering with the lovely public institutions that we have across Ontario. Thank you all very much for your time, for enjoying this session on siberXchange.ca, and I will see you for another session, probably sometime next week. Take care.